Somewhere in the lunchtime crowd, a man climbed down from a wagon, patted his tired horse, and walked away. Nobody remembered his face, and a minute later, one of the busiest corners in America came apart, and the man who'd done it was already gone. More than 100 years on, we still don't know his name or why he decided to bomb Wall Street, but we have some ideas. To understand why someone would aim a bomb at this spot in New York City, it's important to note this wasn't a corner picked at random. In September of 1920, the intersection of Wall and Broad Streets was the financial nerve center of the entire planet, a distinction that hasn't changed much in the intervening years. On one corner stood the New York Stock Exchange, on another, there were offices of the Department of the Treasury, and looming over it all sat 23 Wall Street, the squat marble headquarters of J.P. Morgan, the most powerful private bank on earth. To a certain kind of radical, it was also the beating heart of everything wrong with the world at that moment. It was also, at midday, one of the most crowded places you could possibly find anywhere on earth. The narrow streets filled up at lunchtime with messengers, stenographers, clerks, and runners, the young people who actually kept the machine running. They poured out of the buildings in their thousands, jostling along the pavement, grabbing a sandwich, carrying paperwork from one office to the next. If the attacker wanted to hurt the rich and powerful, he picked the wrong crowd, since these were just ordinary workers. But if the attacker wanted to hurt as many people as possible, he likely couldn't have chosen a more devastating location. America in 1920 was a jittery, frightened place, and a wave of anarchist and revolutionary violence had rolled across the country in 1919. This included a coordinated round of letter bombs and package bombs aimed at judges, politicians, and businessmen. The government had answered with the Palmer raids, rounding up suspected radicals by the trainload. One of the biggest groups targeted by the raid were a group of violent revolutionaries from Italy, the ones who were responsible for that campaign of letter bombs, but more on them shortly. The kingdom of finance and the world of revolutionary politics were already locked in something close to open conflict, and Wall and Broad just happened to be the front line. The morning of Thursday, September 16th, 1920, was absolutely ordinary by the standards of the day. An old horse pulling a covered wagon made its way through the financial district and stopped near the assay office, directly across the street from the Morgan Building. The assay office was formerly part of the Department of Treasury and was responsible for ensuring the purity of gold and silver coins produced by the United States Mint. If you've never heard of this office before, that's because it was dissolved in 1980. But I digress. Let's get back to the narrative. There was nothing remarkable about a horse-drawn delivery wagon on Wall Street, and in fact it would be more odd if it wasn't there. The driver got down from the horse and disappeared into the foot traffic, and for a few minutes the wagon sat there in the sun. Inside it, hidden under whatever covering the bomber had used, sat roughly 100 pounds of dynamite. Packed around the explosive were about 500 pounds of cast iron sash weights, the heavy counterweights used to hold up window frames. They weren't there by accident or to conceal what was inside the wagon if it was examined by the police. Those weights were there to become shrapnel, to scythe outward through the crowd at the speed of a bullet. A timing mechanism ticked quietly down towards zero, and as the bells of nearby Trinity Church finished tolling the noon hour, at 12:01, the wagon detonated. The blast tore straight up and out, and the horse and wagon were obliterated, reduced to fragments scattered across the district. A wall of iron ripped through the lunch crowd, cutting people down where they stood. Windows shattered for blocks in every direction, and awnings caught fire. The marble face of the Morgan Building was scarred and pitted, and inside, glass and debris turned the offices into a slaughterhouse. The shrapnel tore into the surrounding buildings, striking one young man who was simply sitting at his desk working. Out on the street, the dead and the dying lay among the overturned carts and the broken stone. 30 people perished almost instantly, and within days, as the badly wounded slipped away in the city's hospitals, the toll climbed to 38. Some accounts put the final number at 40, and more than 140 others were seriously hurt. Most of them were the young, ordinary office workers who'd simply been on their lunch break. In the first chaotic minutes, the financial district turned into something out of a nightmare, smoke hanging over the bodies, survivors staggering and screaming. One future titan of American life was caught in it. Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of a president not yet born, was reportedly knocked clean off his feet by the shockwave. But the moment that truly deserves to be remembered belongs to a 17-year-old messenger named James Saul. Rather than run, the teenager jumped into a parked automobile and commandeered it Grand Theft Auto style and became the hero of the hour. He loaded it with the wounded and drove 30 injured people to the hospital, trip after trip, while the district was still in chaos. He had no authority to do any of it, he just did it, and in doing so, he saved countless lives. The New York Stock Exchange reacted almost instantly, and within a minute of the explosion, its president halted trading to stop a panic from sweeping the floor. By that afternoon, the exchange's governors had already made their decision. Despite the carnage of the day, the market would open the next morning, on time, as if nothing had happened. Ultimately, the optics are pretty poor, and as you'll see in a moment, this apparent defiance also hindered the investigation. The investigation, as you may have guessed, started almost immediately, and the first real clue had actually surfaced before the bomb ever went off. That morning, a letter carrier making his rounds discovered several crudely printed flyers stuffed into a mailbox a short walk from the blast site. They were printed in rough capital letters, and their message was blunt. They warned that the writers would no longer tolerate the situation, demanded the release of political prisoners, and promised vengeance if those demands weren't met. They were signed by a group calling itself the American Anarchist Fighters, and to the men who would lead the investigation, those flyers said everything. They transformed what was initially treated as a possible accident into an obvious attack, and they pointed in a very specific direction. The crude printing, the threats, the demand to free imprisoned radicals, all of it echoed the flyers left behind during the bombing campaign of the previous year. The head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, William J. Flynn, recognized the pattern immediately. That said, it's never been conclusively proven that these flyers were linked to the attacks at all, and as you'll see, there would be another bizarre coincidence around the attacks. Further, no group called the American Anarchist Fighters was ever identified, further obscuring the origin of the threatening material. Also, I just need to take a moment to appreciate the other possible reading of American Anarchist Fighters, since, of course, it could also imply they were fighting anarchists. Obviously not the case given the context of the letters, but I can see why the name didn't stick to any known group. What followed was one of the largest investigations the country had ever mounted, and one of its most frustrating. The Bureau of Investigation, the New York Police Department's bomb squad, the Secret Service, and a small army of private detectives all converged on the case. And almost immediately they hit a wall partly of their own making. The exchange's defiance had a hidden cost. Eager to prove that business couldn't be stopped, cleanup crews swept the entire scene overnight. Wreckage was hauled away, and the street was scrubbed clean, all while investigators were looking through the scene. By the time investigators might have wanted to comb the area inch by inch, the evidence was already gone, carted off in the dark to make the corner presentable for the morning bell. It's one of the great forensic tragedies of the era, a crime scene erased before anyone had the chance to fully investigate. This has, of course, led to some very tough questions about why the authorities allowed this cleanup effort to take place. What investigators did have was the horse, or what remained of it, which wasn't all that much. One of the few solid leads was a horseshoe, recently fitted, which suggested the animal had been shod not long before the attack. Detectives fanned out to blacksmiths and stables up and down the Atlantic coast, visiting hundreds of them. They hoped a farrier would remember the horse and the man who'd brought it in. They chased the sash weights too, calling on manufacturers and dealers across the country, trying to trace where 500 pounds of window counterweights had come from. Every promising thread frayed, and the blacksmith angle led nowhere conclusive, while the sash weights themselves proved untraceable. A truly bizarre coincidence ended up leading investigators on what turned out to be a wild goose chase. A tennis champion named Edwin Fisher, who'd reportedly mailed out postcards warning friends away from Wall Street days before the blast, turned out to be a dead end. It was initially believed that he had some insight into what would happen, or some sort of involvement. As it turned out, he was simply a troubled man who was constantly predicting disasters and advising his friends to stay away from certain areas. He was the metaphorical broken clock who was right at the day and time in question. In the end, the investigators settled on a theory, even if they could never prove it in court. The most likely culprits, they believed, were Italian anarchists, specifically the followers of Luigi Galliani, the firebrand whose disciples had been behind the 1919 attacks. Those were the attacks on bankers, judges, and others connected to the power structure of America. Galliani himself had already been deported back to Italy for his involvement in a variety of crimes, but his network hadn't vanished with him. The timing told a story of its own, at least according to the investigators. Just 5 days before the bombing, a Massachusetts grand jury had indicted 2 Italian anarchists named Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. This was in connection to a robbery and double slaying in South Braintree, allegedly carried out at the behest of someone involved in this anarchist movement. To the Gallianists, the indictment of 2 of their own was a direct attack, and the bombing landed like an answer, at least according to detectives. One name rose above all the others, and it belonged to a man the police never managed to question. Mario Buda was a Gallianist anarchist with a reputation for building bombs. He was an associate of Sacco and Vanzetti, and a man already entangled in the events that led to their arrest. Later researchers, drawing on accounts from his own relatives and fellow anarchists, came to see him as the most probable bomber. He was reportedly skilled with dynamite and known to pack his devices with iron shrapnel, exactly the signature found at Wall Street. But Buda was never arrested, and the police never even formally questioned him about that day. Within weeks of the explosion, he secured a passport and sailed for Italy, where he stayed for the rest of his life, beyond the reach of American justice. Whether he built the wagon bomb, we'll probably never know, though the case against him is fairly strong, if entirely circumstantial. Notably, even if he was the one who built the massive device, that doesn't answer the question of who actually dumped the horse and carriage there on the day of the attack. Mario Buda was too valuable an asset to his movement to be placed directly near the blast should something go wrong. Investigators chased other possibilities too. Until this day, all of these remain on the table, at least to a certain degree. They examined whether Bolsheviks or radical labor groups might have been responsible, theories that fit the anxious politics of the moment. A federal review of the case years later set those aside and pointed back at the Italian anarchists as the most likely culprits. There's even the view that the entire attack wasn't necessarily an intentional event at all, though this is more a reminder of how little anyone can prove about this case. Some have speculated that there wasn't a plot at all, that the entirety of the events of the day came down to carelessness. Under this theory, the driver of the wagon had carelessly left a wagon full of explosives in a high-risk area and may have actually been amongst the victims. Personally, I find this exceedingly unlikely, especially given the fact that the weights seemed clearly to be designed to function as shrapnel. That said, of course, I'm no expert on how to negligently move hazardous materials through a busy area with a horse and buggy, so maybe this isn't quite as unusual as it sounds. Unfortunately, though, given the fact that so much of the evidence was cleaned up before investigators got to it, I feel obliged to say that it isn't theoretically impossible. The active hunt dragged on for more than 3 years before the leads ran completely dry. The case was shelved over the following years and effectively abandoned by around 1940. The federal government revisited it once more in 1944, reaffirming the anarchist theory and clearing the various radical groups it had once eyed, but no charges ever came. To this day, the Wall Street bombing remains officially unsolved, despite being one of the worst attacks on American soil in history. The property damage alone ran past $2 million in the money of the day, the equivalent of about $33 million today. Of course, that pales in comparison to the human cost of the tragedy, with 38 being the official tally. Given the extreme injuries that people received due to the shrapnel and the poor record-keeping of the time, I would imagine that the true toll may be quite a bit higher. And yet, on the morning of September 17th, less than a day after the tragedy, the New York Stock Exchange opened on schedule. Brokers worked beside windows draped in canvas where the glass had been, and there are documented cases of clerks moving through the building in bandages. That same day, at the very corner where the wagon had stood, a patriotic rally went ahead as planned. Tens of thousands of New Yorkers showed up to sing in open defiance of whoever had done this. J.P. Morgan, the bank, made a decision that turned out to be permanent. And this is how I found out about this attack. The bank never repaired the gouges the iron had carved into its marble walls. They left the scars exactly where they were, a deliberate refusal to pretend the wound had never happened. The pockmarks are still there today, at the corner of Wall and Broad, low on the stone where the lunchtime crowd once stood. Most tourists walk past them every day without knowing what they are, and these remain the closest thing to a confession the bomber ever left behind. It was just past 1 in the morning on March 18, 1990, when 2 men dressed as Boston police officers walked up to the side entrance of a museum and pressed the night buzzer. They told the young guard inside that they were responding to a disturbance call, and he let them in. 81 minutes later, they walked out into the cold air, carrying 13 pieces of priceless art. These include a Vermeer the world hasn't seen since, 3 Rembrandts, a Manet, a handful of Degas sketches, and a Chinese bronze cup older than the Roman Empire. The frames they cut the canvases out of are still hanging on the walls, empty, exactly as the museum's founder once required her collection to be preserved forever. To this day, it remains the largest unsolved property theft in history. Despite a $10 million reward, decades of FBI work, and tips funneled in from informants across 3 separate mob families, not a single one of those pieces has ever turned back up. Isabella Stewart Gardner was a Bostonian by marriage and a New Yorker by birth, an heiress with a sharp eye and a sharper personality. She spent the late 19th century traveling Europe and acquiring whatever caught her attention: Vermeers, Rembrandts, Botticellis, Titians. By the time she stopped, the collection rivaled some national museums, and when she built her own museum on the Fenway in 1903 to house it all, she did something deeply unusual. She dictated in her will that nothing in the building could ever be moved, sold, lent out, or rearranged. If a single object were changed, the entire collection was to be auctioned off and the proceeds given to Harvard. So when the thieves cut those canvases out of their frames in 1990, those frames legally couldn't be removed or filled with substitutes. The empty spots have been part of the permanent display ever since. Like wounds, the institution isn't allowed to dress. That detail alone reshaped the way this case sits in public memory, since most stolen art simply disappears from view. Here, the absence itself has been preserved as a fixture of the building to stay in accordance with the will of the founder. The two men working the overnight shift on March 17th into March 18th, 1990, were a 23-year-old part-timer named Rick Abath and a younger colleague named Randy Hestend. Abath was a long-haired musician who'd graduated from Berklee College of Music. He pulled night shifts at the museum because they paid the bills and gave him time to play in his band. He had a habit of opening the side door during his rounds to check it was secure, an idiosyncrasy that's going to matter later. Around 20 past 1 in the morning, the front desk's external buzzer rang. The voice on the intercom claimed there'd been a disturbance reported in the courtyard. Abath looked at the security monitor and saw two men in Boston Police Department uniforms, one with a bushy mustache, the other clean-shaven, both wearing officer caps pulled low. He buzzed them in, which technically violated standing protocol. The young guards weren't supposed to admit anyone, real cops included, without first contacting their supervisor. Abath admitted later that the two men looked legitimate enough that he didn't think twice about it. What happened next moved with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggests these two thieves had rehearsed. They told Abath there was a warrant out for him and asked him to step away from the desk, which meant stepping away from the only alarm button. The moment he complied, they told him he was being arrested, walked him to the side, and ordered him to call his partner over the radio. When Hestend arrived, both guards were handcuffed, walked into the basement, and bound to pipes more than 100 feet apart, with their eyes, mouths, and hands bound in duct tape. Then the real work began. The two men were inside the building for roughly 81 minutes, moving methodically through the second-floor galleries. In the Dutch room, they cut Rembrandt's only known seascape, a 1633 painting called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, out of its heavy frame with a box cutter. They did the same to A Lady and Gentleman in Black, a Rembrandt portrait that had been part of the museum since the building opened. They unscrewed Vermeer's The Concert from the wall and took a tiny Rembrandt self-portrait etching about the size of a postage stamp. They also pulled down a landscape that was attributed at the time to Rembrandt and was later reassigned to his student Govert Flinck. In the short gallery, they ignored a row of objects worth millions and instead took 5 Degas sketches off the wall. Bizarrely, in this room, they also took a relatively worthless eagle off the top of a Napoleonic-era flag. Down in the blue room, they took Manet's Chez Tortoni, slipping it out of a frame that turned up later sitting on the security supervisor's chair rather than near where the painting had hung. And, in a detail that's puzzled investigators since the morning of the theft, they took an ancient Chinese gu. This is a ceremonial bronze beaker from the Shang dynasty, more than 3,000 years old, and of relatively modest market value compared to the paintings around it. They left far more valuable pieces nearby untouched, including a Titian widely considered the most precious painting in the building. The selection was strange enough that experts have argued ever since about what this could mean. Some believed the thieves were following a specific list, others that they were artistic illiterates, grabbing what looked easiest, or perhaps some combination of the two. By 2:45, the two men had loaded their haul into a vehicle parked outside and driven off into the dark. Abath and Hestend weren't discovered until the morning shift arrived shortly after 8. When the FBI arrived at the museum hours later, they found a scene that didn't quite hold together. The building's motion detectors had logged the thieves' movements through the galleries in granular detail. But that same printout also showed footsteps in the blue room before the buzzer was ever pressed. Abath had walked through the blue room on his earlier rounds that night. But the timing of his patrol, combined with the fact that the empty Manet frame had been left on the security desk chair rather than at the scene, raised an awkward question. Some detectives questioned whether the Manet painting was already off the wall before the thieves walked in, which wouldn't look good for old Ricky Abath. Investigators have circled that anomaly for more than 30 years without resolving it. Rick Abath also did something apparently weird the night before. He led an unknown person into the museum and had a brief discussion with him. The feds actually kept this in their back pocket for 25 years, believing that Abath may have had a role in the heist. Funny enough, though, when the tape was released to the public in 2015, it turned out that the quote-unquote unknown man was positively identified as the museum's deputy security director. Abath maintained until his passing in early 2024 that he had nothing to do with the theft, and he passed multiple polygraph examinations, but the suspicion never fully went away. The thieves themselves left almost nothing physical behind, suggesting that these two were real professionals. A few strips of duct tape with hairs stuck to them were collected, but in 1990 the Bureau didn't have the DNA infrastructure to do anything useful with them. By the time the technology had caught up, the evidence had been handled too many times to yield a clean profile. It also appears that there's a good chance that this genetic evidence actually comes from one of the two security guards, in which case it wouldn't be useful regardless. Within weeks of the theft, leads were drying up fast, and the case quickly went cold. In the years that followed, the museum offered a $1 million reward for the safe return of the works. That figure rose to $5 million in 1997, and then to $10 million in 2017, which is where it sits today. The Massachusetts statute of limitations on the original theft ran out in 1995, meaning that the men who actually carried out the heist can no longer be charged for it under state law. Possession of stolen property remains a crime, but the Bureau has long signaled that it's far more interested in getting the art back than in prosecuting whoever's currently holding it. Despite this rather lenient policy to those responsible for the heist, none of that has shaken anything loose. There have been false leads, hoaxes, and ransom demands, including an anonymous letter in 1994 that promised the return of all 13 works in exchange for $2.5 million. The museum was prepared to entertain it, but the writer went silent. There have also been scattered sightings reported over the years, but none of them could be confirmed, and none of the tips has produced a single recovered piece of fine art. In 2013, the FBI publicly announced that it had identified the men who carried out the theft, and that they had been members of a criminal organization based in New England. The Bureau declined to name them, citing the ongoing investigation, but a series of leaks, sentencings, and informant statements over the years has filled in much of the picture. The two leading suspects most often named in connection with the theft are Robert Donati, a Boston associate of the Patriarca crime family. The other was David Houghton, another associate with deep ties to the same underworld. Donati was found in the trunk of his own Cadillac in 1991, having met a violent end widely believed to be tied to either the heist or his broader mob involvement. Houghton passed of natural causes in 1992, so both were gone within 2 years of the theft. Investigators have also focused on Carmelo Merlino, who ran an auto body shop in Dorchester that the Bureau came to see as a hub for trafficking the stolen works. Merlino was caught in a federal sting attempting to rob an armored car depot in 1999 and passed in federal prison in 2005. He reportedly told associates he could deliver the paintings in exchange for leniency, only to fail to produce them when pressed. Robert Gentile, a Connecticut mob figure linked to the Philadelphia faction, was the last surviving person of interest. Federal agents searched his property repeatedly, and they found a list of the stolen artworks with what appeared to be black market valuations scribbled beside them. But they didn't find any of the missing art, and the man himself passed in 2021, denying to the end that he ever had the paintings. This remained the case even when the Bureau offered to drop unrelated weapons charges in exchange for information. The most likely chain of custody, based on what investigators have pieced together, runs from the thieves themselves through Boston area mob connections. It then goes south through a New England associate named Robert Guarente, whose widow told the feds in 2010 that her husband had handed 2 of the paintings off to Gentile in 2003. Another theory, which has now largely been discredited but was once popular, was that Whitey Bulger, the infamous Boston mob boss, was responsible. One of the reasons for this connection was the highly accurate police uniforms worn by the robbers. Let's just say that Bulger had what could euphemistically be described as a pretty close relationship with local law and federal law enforcement. Ultimately, though, the evidence doesn't seem to line up, and at the time of the heist, Bulger's outfit was in a heated rivalry with the Patriarca crime family. Also, as usual, no high-level Boston crime story would be complete without a mention of Bulger's organization and the Patriarca family. Theories about where the works are currently sitting right now range from the plausible to highly speculative. The most grounded view is that they were used as collateral for underworld deals and were never sold openly because they were too famous to fence. Under this theory, they've likely been stashed somewhere, and they're slowly deteriorating from the decades of neglect. A more romantic version has them sitting on the wall of a private collector's secret gallery. This is the so-called Dr. No hypothesis, though most experts consider that scenario more popular in fiction than in life. The grimmest possibility is that the paintings were destroyed by whoever ended up holding them, either because the heat got unbearable or because they didn't understand how to store them. The Vermeer in particular, a panel more than 3 centuries old, wouldn't survive long in a damp basement or a humid storage unit. Investigators speaking to museum staff over the years have generally said they believe at least some of the 13 works still exist somewhere, but no one will say so with confidence. The longer the works stay missing, the more uncertain that increasingly faint hope becomes. A 19-year-old missionary disappeared from her family's Bronx home one Wednesday morning in the summer of 1909. A short telegram arrived from Washington a few days later, signed in her initials, telling her parents not to worry and that she'll be home soon. 9 days after she vanished, in a locked tenement room above a Chinese restaurant on 8th Avenue, 2 men cut the rope binding a heavy steamer trunk and lifted the lid. The man whose apartment it was had already slipped out of New York City and into one of the largest manhunts the country had ever seen. Elsie Siegel was born in 1889 into one of New York's more visible families. Her grandfather was Franz Siegel, the German-born Union general who didn't have the greatest battlefield record, but could recruit German Americans in droves. Her father Paul lived comfortably, and her mother Anne taught Sunday school for years at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church on 5th Avenue. That class was aimed specifically at young Chinese men trying to learn English and find their footing in New York. Anne started bringing Elsie along when her daughter was still a teenager, and by 1909 the girl was doing missionary outreach in Chinatown on her own. On June 9, 1909, Elsie left the family's Wadsworth Avenue apartment and didn't come back. Her parents weren't immediately panicked, as she'd recently been spending time with her grandmother in Washington, and trips like that weren't unusual. A few days into her absence, a telegram arrived from the capital. The message was brief and reassuring. She'd be home by the end of the week, no need to worry, signed with her initials, and to Paul and Anne, that closed the matter. The trouble was that Elsie hadn't sent it, and by the time the wire reached Wadsworth Avenue, She'd been dead almost a week. A few blocks south of Central Park, at 782 8th Avenue, a man named Sun Lung ran a Chinese food place on the third floor of a 4-story walk-up. Upstairs lived his cousin, a Chinese immigrant who went by several names, but most commonly, William Leon. Sun hadn't seen him in close to a week. On June 18th, worried, he climbed the stairs to bang on his cousin's door, but no one answered. There was something else, though. A smell was coming through the door that he couldn't quite talk himself out of. He walked to the West 47th Street police station and asked an officer to come back with him. Patrolman John Reardon pried the door open and the room was almost empty, just a bed and a heavy trunk lashed shut with a rope. When Reardon cut the rope and tried the lid, what was inside pushed it open the rest of the way. Bent double and wrapped in a sheet was a young woman who had clearly been there for many days. She was wearing some jewelry, including a thin gold chain with an initialed pendant and a bracelet engraved with the letters E.L.S. A cousin of Leon's named Joe was tracked down quickly and told detectives Leon's sweetheart had been the granddaughter of General Siegel. He'd seen the pair of them out at the theater together, and a detective rode uptown to the Siegel home. The family's first answer was that Elsie wasn't missing. She was just away visiting the capital. Pressed, they admitted they hadn't actually heard from her in over a week, and Paul was taken to view the body. According to the police account, he looked at the remains and at the jewelry and refused to identify either. Anne was brought in afterward, and she was able to identify both immediately. There was more behind Paul's hesitation than just grief. There was also the matter of his familial reputation on the line. The investigators going through Leon's apartment had already found roughly 35 love letters in Elsie's handwriting, scattered across the floor. They weren't shy letters, and they referred to sacrifices made for him, family she'd risked, devotion she promised wouldn't quit. There were other women's letters mixed in as well, and Leon, as the press would soon notice, didn't lack for correspondence from women, but it was Elsie's that stacked the highest. A few blocks east on Mott Street, a man named Chu Gain managed the Port Arthur restaurant, one of Chinatown's nicer rooms. When detectives brought him in for questioning, Chu Gain made a few admissions of his own. He'd also been seeing Elsie, and he had recent letters from her, in which she called him her one true love, and asked him not to mind that Leon was hanging around. Chu told police he'd been getting anonymous notes threatening both his life and Elsie's if he didn't break off the affair, and he believed Leon had written them. The picture investigators put together looked roughly like this. Elsie had met Leon 4 years earlier. He was running a small Chinese food restaurant called a chop suey place, using the lingo of the time, on Amsterdam Avenue not far from the Siegel home. Anne Siegel had taken her daughter into Chinese restaurants on missionary rounds, and Leon had become a familiar face. He started sitting with the Siegels at church, visited their home, took mother and daughter on tours of Chinatown. At some point, the friendship became something else, and Leon had even lived briefly under the Siegel roof, though the true nature of the relationship was unknown to her parents. Just over a week before Elsie disappeared, he'd shown up at a police station asking for an officer to accompany him to the family's house. He claimed Anne owed him $300, and he wanted to retrieve his clothes without trouble. By the spring of 1909, Elsie had also taken up with Chu Gain, and Leon eventually figured it out. Witnesses said he showed up drunk to a party at the Siegel home on the evening of June 8th, and pulled Elsie aside to warn her that if she kept seeing Chu, he'd cut them both down. The next morning, June 9th, Elsie left home, and instead of going to her grandmother's, she went to 782 8th Avenue. Leon hadn't lived in that apartment alone, and his roommate, a Chinese man named Chong Sing, also vanished on June 9th. A few days after the trunk was found, a man named Harvey Kennedy hired a new Chinese cook from an employment agency on West 29th Street. The next morning, he opened the paper and recognized his new cook in the manhunt photograph. Police picked Chong Sing up. His statements changed repeatedly over the early days of the investigation. The version he eventually settled on was that Elsie had come to the apartment that morning to confront Leon to tell him to stop visiting the family. Chong Sing said he was downstairs when she arrived, then went up and heard a struggle from the next room. Through a partly open door, he claimed to have seen Leon throw Elsie onto the bed and end her life, a fact that struck detectives as odd. Chong Sing, for his part, was a strapping, physically imposing young man, and the idea that he didn't attempt to stop the attack was suspicious at best. He said he walked in afterward, touched her hand, and was told she was already deceased. Then, by his telling, he handed Leon $200 of his own dollars, apparently so that William Leon could escape, and then Chong Sing walked over to the Port Arthur restaurant. Sing convinced Chu Gain that William would leave town for good if he was bankrolled, and Chu emptied the till for $260. For Chu Gain, his motivation for doing this was apparent. He wanted to clear out a romantic rival. Chong Sing brought it back to the apartment and watched Leon put Elsie's body in the trunk. Parts of that story matched what police could verify on their own, but other parts remained mysterious. For instance, the transaction between Chong Sing and Chu Gain could be verified as having actually happened. But what happened next is a bit more bizarre. Within an hour or two of the time Chong Sing claimed the slaying happened, Leon had walked into the Constitution Express Company on 8th Avenue. Leon paid a driver named Arthur Logan to move the trunk uptown to a laundry service, though the reasoning for this move was unclear. Then, that night, he hired a chauffeur to take him and the trunk over to a Chinese restaurant in Newark, where he tried to leave it indefinitely. The Newark man refused, and the trunk made its way back to 782 8th Avenue the following afternoon, and there it sat, in a locked room. It would sit there until Reardon forced the door 8 days later in the presence of Sun Leung. When the coroner's jury met on September 24th, 1909, it named William Leon as the man responsible for Elsie's death by asphyxiation. Chong Sing, who had been held as a potential collaborator on a $10,000 bond, was released for lack of evidence to charge him. Personally, I find this part a little bit bizarre, since everything indicates that Chong Sing was, at the very least, an accessory after the fact. Anyway, I looked into this offense a bit more, and it existed as a common law offense at the time of the crime, but it wouldn't be codified until 1965 in New York. I suspect the reason he was never charged is that proving the offense beyond a reasonable doubt would be problematic without William Leon's testimony. By then, Leon's face had been on the front page of nearly every major newspaper in North America for 3 months. Police rounded up Chinese men with even a vague resemblance to him from California to the Canadian Maritimes. Steamships bound for Asia were searched cabin by cabin. Reported sightings poured in from Cuba, Texas, the Midwest, the West Coast, even the Far East itself. The telegram from Washington, the one signed with Elsie's initials, was traced to a Chinese man matching Leon's description, who'd handed it in at the wire office on June 11th. However, that said, it remains unclear if this individual was actually Leon or someone else. But as you'll see, detectives of the time didn't consider other possibilities. That was 2 days after Elsie had already been put in the trunk, and investigators came to believe Leon himself had sent the message. They believed that this was partly to buy time and partly to set up a trail leading anywhere but 8th Avenue. The case dominated American newspapers through the summer and into the fall, and a touring show based on the case played theaters across the country. Anne Siegel, by some accounts, suffered a breakdown and underwent experimental psychiatric treatment after coming to believe her own missionary work had led her daughter to that fate. William Leon was never found, and theories rushed in to fill the space he'd left almost immediately. One version had him on a steamship for China, under another name where he lived out his life, never to return to the United States. Another theory said members of a Chinese organized crime group in New York City tracked him down and eliminated him. Under this theory, William Leon had brought an immense amount of police intrusion into Chinatown, and these figures wanted him gone. A third theory, perhaps the most bizarre of all, claimed he'd taken Elsie alive with him, and the body in the trunk belonged to some other woman entirely. Under this theory, he eliminated another woman and put Elsie's jewelry on her, while letting the decomposition make her largely unrecognizable. Notably, while this theory was popular at the time, it was popular because it was lurid, and it moved papers. There was never any evidence to support this, despite numerous questionable press outlets reporting sightings as a front-page news story for the next decade or so. Still another theory claims that William Leon was himself a victim, and that Chong Sing may have been the man who eliminated him. Under this theory, Chu Gain gave the money to Chong Sing not to ensure that William Leon left New York City, but fulfill a hit on the man, eliminating a romantic rival. However, this theory doesn't meaningfully explain why Elsie also perished, since this would run contrary to what Chu Gain wanted. Anyway, all I can say for sure is that I believe that Chong Sing was likely much more involved than he made himself out to be.